On July 29, 2021, the Russian module Nauka had just docked to the International Space Station after spending 8 years delayed on the ground. 8 years of technical problems, funding shortfalls, and bureaucratic delays, while the module sat in a warehouse, slowly degrading. The crew was celebrating a new laboratory, new capabilities, a fresh addition to a station that had been under construction since 1998. Then, without warning, Nauka's thrusters fired on their own. The entire 420 metric ton station started rotating, slowly at first, then faster. Flight controllers in Houston scrambled to understand what was happening as the ISS spun through 540 degrees, 1.5 full rotations, with no one at the controls causing it. The flight director declared a spacecraft emergency, the first one in the station's entire history. That designation carries real weight. It means the crew and vehicle are in immediate danger, that normal procedures are out the window, and that every available resource gets thrown at the problem at once. Cosmonauts fired the Zvezda module's thrusters to counter the spin, while a docked Progress cargo ship burned its engines in the opposite direction. The two systems working against Nauka's misfiring engines in a tug-of-war, taking place 400 kilometers above the Earth. For 47 minutes, the largest structure humans have ever placed in orbit was tumbling through space, its solar panels straining, its docking ports stressed, its communication links with the ground repeatedly cutting in and out as the antennas swept away from their targets. 7 people were on board. They got it under control, barely. But the Nauka incident is just one chapter in the wild, terrifying, and genuinely inspiring story of the International Space Station. A floating laboratory that cost roughly $150 billion to build, that nearly got canceled by a single vote in Congress, and that is now scheduled to be deliberately crashed into the Pacific Ocean before the end of this decade. This is that story. But before we start, I want to tell you something. A lot of strange things have been happening in space lately, so subscribe to this channel right now, and I'll tell you even more secrets of space. And write in the comments below what you think about all of this. To understand how the ISS got built, you have to go back to the Cold War. In 1984, President Ronald Reagan stood before Congress and proposed the permanent American space station. He called it Space Station Freedom, and it was supposed to be the next great leap in human spaceflight, a natural successor to the triumphs of the Apollo moon landings and the ambitions of the Space Shuttle program. NASA invited Canada, Japan, and the European Space Agency to join the project in 1988. Freedom was envisioned as a gleaming symbol of Western technological dominance, a fortress of science and ingenuity, hanging in the sky for the whole world to see. But the Soviet Union had other plans. They were already operating Mir, the world's first modular space station, a remarkable feat of engineering that had been continuously expanded and upgraded since its launch in 1986. And beyond Mir, Soviet engineers were already drafting blueprints for its successor, Mir 2, an even more ambitious outpost that would cement Russian supremacy in long-duration spaceflight. Then, almost without warning, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Russia was broke, its economy in free fall, its institutions crumbling. But what it still possessed was extraordinary. Some of the most experienced space engineers on the planet, and a vast launch infrastructure anchored by the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, a facility that had been sending humans into orbit since Yuri Gagarin. So in 1993, the Clinton administration made a bold and historically significant call. Rather than compete with Russia's remaining space capabilities, they would merge Space Station Freedom with the core concepts from Russia's Mir 2 design. Former Cold War enemies, nations that had spent decades pointing nuclear warheads at each other, would now build a space station together. Not everyone was thrilled about this. The political path forward was anything but smooth. In June 1993, the U.S. House of Representatives voted on whether to cancel the entire project outright. The result was 215 votes to continue, and 216 to keep it alive. One single vote saved the International Space Station from never existing. Pause and let that sink in. The most expensive object humanity has ever constructed, a structure that would eventually cost over $150 billion and take more than a decade to assemble, survived by the thinnest possible margin in a single congressional vote. With the political drama finally settled, 15 nations signed an intergovernmental agreement on January 29, 1998. 5 space agencies would pool their resources, expertise, and national pride into a single shared endeavor. NASA from the United States, Roscosmos from Russia, the European Space Agency representing its member nations, JAXA from Japan, and the Canadian Space Agency. The first piece went up on November 20th, 1998. It was a module called Zarya, which means sunrise in Russian, a fitting name for the dawn of something entirely new. Zarya was designed and built in Moscow by the Khrunichev State Research and Production Space Center, but NASA footed the entire $220 million bill through a contract with Boeing. So, the very first piece of the International Space Station was American-funded and Russian-built, launched aboard a Russian Proton rocket from a cosmodrome deep in the steppes of Kazakhstan. That tension and that partnership would come to define everything about the station that followed. 2 weeks later, Space Shuttle Endeavour carried up the Unity node, the first American-made component, a connecting passageway that would eventually link together the growing complex. On December 10, 1998, Commander Robert Cabana and Russian cosmonaut Sergei Krikalev floated to the hatch between the two modules, turned the handle, and pushed it open together. An American and a Russian, entering humanity's new home in orbit for the very first time. But a space station without people living in it is just an expensive tin can in the sky. That changed on November 2nd, 2000, when Expedition 1 arrived. NASA astronaut Bill Shepard and cosmonauts Yuri Gidzenko and Sergei Krikalev launched aboard a Soyuz rocket and docked to the station. They moved in, unpacked their equipment, and got to work. And someone has been living up there ever since. As of late 2025, that streak had reached 25 years of continuous human presence in space, the longest in history by a massive margin. No other outpost humanity has ever built, on land, at sea, or anywhere else, comes remotely close. Over the next decade after that first crew arrived, the station grew piece by piece across more than 40 major launches. The American Destiny Laboratory, Canada's Canadarm2 robotic arm, Europe's Columbus Laboratory, Japan's Kibo module, each edition expanding what the station could do and how many people it could support. Assembly was effectively completed in 2011 when the Space Shuttle Atlantis carried up the Alpha Magnetic Spectrometer, a cosmic ray detector that represents one of the most sophisticated physics experiments ever deployed in orbit. Today, the ISS stretches 109 meters across its solar arrays. That is wider than an American football field, including the end zones. It weighs approximately 420,000 kilograms, has roughly the same livable volume as a 6-bedroom house, and orbits the Earth at 27,600 kilometers per hour. At that speed, it circles the entire planet once every 93 minutes, which means the crew sees 16 sunrises and 16 sunsets every single day, a continuous procession of dawns and dusks that no human being in history ever witnessed before the station existed. Now here's where it gets really interesting. How do you actually live on this thing? The station runs on Greenwich Mean Time, so that Mission Control in Houston and the Russian Control Center in Korolyov can both coordinate with the crew without the confusion of operating across different clocks. A typical day starts around 6 in the morning. The crew gets 8 hours for sleep, roughly 2.5 hours for mandatory exercise, and 3 scheduled meals. The exercise is not optional. Without it, the human body begins losing bone density and muscle mass at a startling rate in microgravity, and astronauts on 6-month missions can shed years' worth of physical conditioning in a matter of weeks. Sleeping in microgravity is exactly as strange as it sounds. Each crew member has a phone booth-sized private cabin, just enough space for a laptop, a few personal items, and a sleeping bag attached to the wall. They zip themselves in so they do not drift away and bump into equipment during the night. Most astronauts also wear earplugs and eye masks because the ventilation fans that keep air circulating throughout the station run constantly and never stop. One astronaut famously described it as trying to sleep inside a vacuum cleaner. The bathroom situation is even more illuminating. There are no showers on the ISS. Astronauts clean themselves with rinseless shampoo and wet wipes, working around their bodies carefully in the absence of running water. The toilet uses vacuum suction to pull waste away from the body in place of gravity, and getting the positioning right is apparently a skill that takes some practice. Urine goes through a dedicated hose into the station's water recovery system, which filters and processes it through multiple purification stages before recycling it back into drinking water. It sounds unsettling, but the resulting water is, by most measures, cleaner than what comes out of a tap in many cities on Earth. The system recovers somewhere between 93 and 98% of all water aboard the station. Yes, that means yesterday's coffee literally becomes tomorrow's coffee. The food options span about 300 different varieties, mostly freeze-dried or sealed in pouches, engineered to survive the journey and the environment. You will never find regular bread up there, and the reason is surprisingly mundane: crumbs. In microgravity, crumbs float freely through the air, and they can clog air vents, contaminate equipment, or drift directly into someone's eyes. So tortillas replaced bread entirely, becoming one of the most practical and enduring adaptations of life in orbit. And because microgravity gradually dulls your sense of taste, a consequence of fluid shifting toward the head and creating a permanent congestion-like effect, the most consistently requested item on resupply manifests is Tabasco hot sauce. Astronauts essentially need their food to punch harder, just to taste like anything at all. The biggest daily time commitment is exercise. 2 hours, mandatory, with no exceptions. In microgravity, the human body begins to dismantle itself at a startling pace. Without the constant mechanical load that gravity places on muscles and bones, you can lose up to 20% of your muscle mass, and between 1 and 2% of your bone density every single month. The station is equipped with a resistance machine that simulates free weights by using a vacuum cylinder to create load, a treadmill where astronauts strap themselves down with bungee harnesses to stay in contact with the belt, and a stationary bike. None of it is optional. Miss enough sessions, and returning to Earth becomes a medical emergency rather than a homecoming. But the station has also had some genuinely fun moments tucked inside its operational history. In May 2001, Pizza Hut paid the Russian Space Agency roughly $1 million to deliver a 6-inch vacuum-sealed pizza aboard a Progress cargo ship. The original plan called for pepperoni, but pepperoni grew mold during pressurized testing, so they switched to salami instead. Cosmonaut Yuri Usachev aided on camera inside the Zvezda service module, while NASA astronauts watched from the American segment of the station, forbidden from participating because of NASA's strict anti-advertising policy. Pizza Hut also painted their logo on the side of the Proton rocket that carried the pizza into orbit, making it the first commercial brand to appear on an orbital launch vehicle. Say what you will about marketing departments, but that is commitment of a particular and impressive kind. Then in 2015, Italian astronaut Samantha Cristoforetti drank the first proper espresso ever made in orbit, using a custom-built machine called iEspresso, sipping from a specially designed zero-gravity cup, engineered so that capillary action would draw the liquid toward the rim and allow the aroma to actually reach her nose. The cup was as much a feat of fluid dynamics engineering as the machine itself. Some people solve problems. Italians solved the espresso problem first. Now, beyond being a very expensive apartment with a genuinely extraordinary view, the station exists as one of humanity's most capable scientific platforms, and the research conducted aboard it has produced results that are simply impossible to replicate on Earth. The single largest category of that research is protein crystal growth, with over 500 dedicated experiments completed by 2021 alone. In microgravity, protein crystals grow larger and far more uniformly than they ever could on the ground, because there is no gravitational force disturbing the molecules as they slowly arrange themselves into structure. The absence of convection currents and sedimentation allows crystals to form with a precision that terrestrial labs cannot match. Japanese researchers used ISS-grown crystals to develop a drug candidate called TAS-205, targeting Duchenne muscular dystrophy, which subsequently completed human clinical trials. Separately, Merck crystallized their blockbuster cancer immunotherapy drug, Keytruda, in orbit, producing a more uniform molecular form that could support a simpler subcutaneous injection version rather than the existing intravenous formulation. To put that in perspective, we are talking about potentially reformulating a drug that generates over $25 billion in annual revenue. Then there is the alpha magnetic spectrometer, a particle physics detector mounted directly to the exterior of the station. Since 2011, it has captured over 120 billion cosmic ray events and detected an unusual excess of high-energy positrons that could represent genuine evidence of dark matter. The data is broadly consistent with theoretical predictions, but a definitive conclusion has not yet been reached. And then there is the NASA Twin Study, one of the most remarkable human experiments ever conducted in orbit. In 2015, astronaut Scott Kelly traveled to the ISS for 340 consecutive days, while his identical twin brother Mark remained on Earth as a control subject, offering scientists an almost perfect natural experiment. Researchers compared everything they could measure: DNA expression, gut bacteria composition, cognitive performance, bone density, and more. Scott grew approximately 5 centimeters taller in space due to spinal decompression, as the vertebrae expanded without the constant pressure of gravity. He lost that extra height once he returned to Earth. His telomeres actually lengthened in space, which was the precise opposite of what researchers had anticipated, though they shortened rapidly again after he landed. The most striking finding was that about 91% of Scott Kelly's altered gene expression returned to baseline within 6 months of landing. But roughly 7% of those genetic changes, particularly in genes involved in immune response and DNA repair, never fully reverted to normal. The study involved only a single pair of twins, so the findings are suggestive rather than definitive, and scientists are careful not to overgeneralize from one data point. Even so, it gave researchers the most detailed and intimate picture ever assembled of what long-duration spaceflight does to the human body at a molecular level. The station has even pushed into agriculture. In August 2015, the crew harvested and ate red romaine lettuce grown in the onboard veggie chamber, making it the first fresh produce ever consumed in space. Since then, astronauts have successfully cultivated zinnias, radishes, and dwarf tomatoes. This research is critical for any future crewed mission to Mars, where crews will be entirely dependent on their ability to grow their own food across journeys that could last years. The ISS has also had moments where things went seriously and genuinely wrong, where the difference between a good decision and a catastrophic one was measured in centimeters and seconds. In 2007, astronaut Scott Parazynski had to repair a torn solar array using an improvised tool fashioned from available materials, working at the very end of an extended robotic arm, far from the safety of the station's hull. One wrong move could have sent a lethal electrical charge through his suit from the array's live current. In 2010, an ammonia coolant pump failed, threatening the thermal regulation of the entire station. The crew performed 3 emergency spacewalks over 9 grueling days to replace a 350-kilogram pump module, working against the clock before rising internal temperatures could render the station uninhabitable. The threat from orbital debris is relentless and never entirely predictable. On June 28, 2011, a piece of space junk was calculated to pass within just 340 meters of the station at roughly 47,000 kilometers per hour. There were only 15 hours of warning. The 6-person crew sealed themselves inside their 2 Soyuz escape capsules and waited in tense silence. The debris missed, but comparable shelter-in-place events have been repeated multiple times since, a reminder that the station exists inside an increasingly crowded and dangerous orbital environment. In May 2013, ammonia coolant began leaking visibly from the P6 truss, with white flakes streaming outward into the void, clearly visible on the station's external cameras. 2 days later, astronauts Chris Cassidy and Tom Marshburn suited up for an emergency spacewalk and replaced the leaking pump control box, restoring the system before any lasting damage could take hold. Ammonia is toxic, and any contamination reaching the station's air supply could have been catastrophic, putting every crew member at immediate risk. Then in August 2018, the crew discovered a 2-millimeter hole in a docked Soyuz capsule that was slowly leaking air into space. They patched it with tape and epoxy, an improvised fix that held. But the incident sparked a bizarre and damaging controversy when Russian officials suggested, without evidence, that an American astronaut had drilled the hole deliberately, perhaps to manufacture a medical emergency and secure an early return to Earth. That claim was widely dismissed by investigators and the broader space community, and the actual cause of the damage was never officially determined. Then came the Nauka spin incident in 2021, when a newly docked Russian module accidentally fired its thrusters and sent the entire station rotating out of control. The crew regained stability, but nerves were clearly fraying. Just a year later, things got even scarier. On December 14, 2022, the Soyuz MS-22 capsule docked to the station started leaking coolant in a dramatic, almost otherworldly stream of white particles that scattered into the void around the station. A micrometeoroid had likely punctured the external coolant loop, a small piece of space debris moving fast enough to cause serious structural damage. The problem was that the Soyuz was supposed to be the ride home for cosmonauts Sergei Prokopy and Dmitry Petelin, and NASA astronaut Frank Rubio. Without a functioning thermal control system, the capsule's interior temperatures during re-entry could have become dangerous, even lethal. With their capsule damaged and no immediate alternative, the three of them were effectively stranded. Russia launched an empty replacement Soyuz in February 2023, but the crew could not leave until it arrived and was fully inspected and certified for human transport. Frank Rubio's mission, originally planned to last around 6 months, ultimately stretched to 371 days. That made him the holder of the longest single spaceflight in American history, a record he never intended to set. And if you think the danger stays in orbit, think again. On March 8, 2024, a 1.5-pound chunk of an ISS battery pallet that had been jettisoned 3 years earlier came screaming through the atmosphere and crashed through the roof of a house in Naples, Florida. NASA had modeled and expected it to burn up completely on re-entry, as most debris does. It did not. Through all of these crises and breakthroughs, the station has welcomed roughly 300 visitors from 26 countries, representing one of the most sustained examples of international cooperation in human history. The record for most people on board at the same time is 13, set during a space shuttle visit in July 2009, when 2 crews briefly shared the same corridors floating through modules the size of school buses. In April 2001, American businessman Dennis Tito became the first space tourist to visit the station. He was 60 years old, a former JPL engineer who had left aerospace and made his fortune managing investment funds. He paid the Russian space agency $20 million for an 8-day trip, and NASA was furious. Administrator Dan Golden publicly opposed the flight, arguing that Tito was not adequately trained and that hosting a paying civilian would compromise the professional nature of the mission. Tito went anyway. After him came Mark Shuttleworth from South Africa, Cirque du Soleil founder Guy Laliberté, and eventually the fully commercial Axiom missions, which began ferrying private crews to the station as a preview of what orbital tourism might look like at scale. Then there is Peggy Whitson, the first female commander of the ISS, the first woman to command it twice, and the oldest female spacewalker in history at age 57. After the Axiom 4 mission in 2025, she accumulated 675 total days in space, more than any American astronaut, and more than any woman in history. Her career represents a kind of quiet persistence that tends to outlast the headline-grabbing moments. And then there is Chris Hadfield. In 2013, the Canadian astronaut became the first Canadian to command a spacecraft, which would have been achievement enough. But what made him genuinely famous was something else entirely. On May 12, 2013, he released a cover of David Bowie's Space Oddity, recorded inside the station itself, drifting through modules while playing guitar in microgravity. It was the first music video ever filmed in space. It went massively viral. Bowie's own team called it possibly the most touching version of the song ever created. But beyond the music, Hadfield's steady stream of social media posts, showing the texture of daily life in zero gravity, wringing out a wet towel, and watching the water cling in a trembling bubble around his hands, demonstrating how tears form but don't fall without gravity, photographing the curve of the Earth through the cupola observation dome at golden hour, completely transformed how ordinary people connected with what it actually feels like to live and work in orbit. The cupola itself deserves a mention. Built by the European Space Agency and installed in 2010, it is a 7-window observation dome that grants a full 360-degree view of both Earth and the cosmos beyond. Astronauts consistently describe it as the single best experience the station has to offer. During their rare moments of free time, most of them drift toward it and simply float there, watching the planet slowly roll by beneath them. It is where nearly every breathtaking Earth photograph you have ever encountered online was taken. Those sweeping shots of hurricanes, city lights, and mountain ranges that make the planet look almost impossibly beautiful from above. But even with all of this extraordinary history behind it, the ISS carries an expiration date. The station cannot remain in orbit forever. After more than 25 years of continuous habitation, it is showing its age in ways that are difficult to ignore. The Russian segment has developed structural cracks and suffered multiple coolant leaks, raising ongoing concerns about the long-term integrity of those modules. Systems that were originally engineered for a 15-year operational lifespan have been pushed well past their intended limits through a combination of maintenance, improvisation, and sheer determination. The United States, Canada, Japan, and the European partners have collectively committed to operating the station through 2030. Russia, however, has only formally committed through 2028, adding a layer of political uncertainty to an already complex end-of-life scenario. On June 26, 2024, NASA awarded SpaceX an $843 million contract to build what is being called the U.S. D-Orbit vehicle, a heavily modified spacecraft derived from the Dragon capsule architecture. The plan unfolds in stages. Once the final crew departs in late 2030, the station will spend roughly a year gradually drifting lower as atmospheric drag slowly pulls it down from its orbit. Then, the D-Orbit vehicle will dock with the station, carefully align its trajectory, and execute a final controlled burn, driving the entire structure into a deliberate re-entry aimed at Point Nemo, the most remote location in the Pacific Ocean, sitting approximately 2,700 kilometers from the nearest land in any direction. It is already the designated resting place for Russia's old Mir station, and hundreds of other retired spacecraft that have been guided to their end over its cold, empty waters. Still, nothing anywhere near this massive has ever been intentionally deorbited before. It will be, by a significant margin, the largest controlled atmospheric re-entry ever attempted. But that brings us to the uncomfortable question lurking beneath all of this planning. What exactly replaces it? Several companies are racing to develop commercial space stations intended to fill the void. VAST is targeting their Haven 1 module for launch as early as 2026. Axiom Space has secured NASA contracts and is working toward its own orbital platform. Blue Origin is developing a concept called Orbital Reef. Voyager Space and Airbus are collaborating on a station called Starlab. Each of these projects represents genuine ambition and real investment. Yet analysts reported in late 2025 that none of these commercial replacements are likely to be fully operational by the time the ISS finally comes down. That assessment points toward a potentially significant gap in continuous American human presence in low Earth orbit. And that gap would open precisely as China's Tiangong station continues to expand its capabilities and crew rotations. For 25 years, human beings have lived and worked continuously in space without interruption. That remarkable, unbroken streak might actually come to an end before a suitable replacement is ready. The International Space Station is, in many ways, a living contradiction. It is simultaneously the greatest international engineering collaboration in human history. Built by 15 nations that could barely agree on anything else, it survived political threats, budget cuts, debris strikes, ammonia leaks, coolant failures, and an unplanned 540-degree spin. It turned urine into drinking water clean enough to rival your morning coffee, grew lettuce under LED lights in the vacuum of low Earth orbit, detected possible evidence of dark matter, and helped develop drugs that could treat muscular dystrophy and cancer. A pizza was delivered there once, floated through the hatch and everything. An Italian astronaut engineered a proper espresso in microgravity, because some standards are non-negotiable regardless of altitude. A Canadian recorded a David Bowie music video inside it, drifting weightless through a tin can very far from Earth, which feels like exactly the right place for that song. And on clear nights, if you look up at the right time, you can see it with your own eyes. Not a blinking light, not a satellite tumbling uncertainly across the horizon, but a bright, steady dot moving with quiet purpose across the sky. About the size of a football field, traveling at 7.66 kilometers per second, carrying a handful of humans who are circling the entire planet once every 93 minutes. Some stayed for months at a stretch, watching 16 sunrises a day, their bones slowly thinning, their hearts gradually reshaping themselves in the absence of gravity. Frank Rubio stayed for over a year, not entirely by choice, because his ride home developed a leak and the situation required some improvisation. Within the next few years, all of it will be deliberately driven back into the atmosphere and scattered in pieces across the most remote stretch of ocean on Earth. The most expensive object humanity has ever constructed, the most visited, the most continuously inhabited structure we have ever placed beyond our own sky, will end its life at a place called Point Nemo, named after the captain from 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. It is a point in the South Pacific so far from any coastline that the nearest humans to it are often the astronauts aboard the station itself. You could not make this stuff up. That's all for today. If you like space stories and want to stay up to date with new episodes, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. See you in the next podcast.